morning. This lecture video is going to go over the different structures that are involved in our digestive system. So we'll kind of go over all of these structures and you can label them first. Then we'll look at a chart that talks about the different functions of all of these different organs, like what's happening as food works its way down. And then we're going to look specifically at the specific parts of your oral cavity, your tooth, your stomach, etc., etc. So that's kind of how this is going to work out. So your digestive tract is a long tube that is open on both ends, so opening it in your mouth, and then it comes out the anus, where food is going to pass through. And as that food is passed through, it's going to be chemically broken down into nutrients that our cells can use for energy, and then mechanically broken down, just physically broken down into smaller pieces. So we have these two types of digestion that takes place: mechanical digestion, or physically breaking apart food, and then chemical digestion, which is breaking the food into its very smallest chemical and nutrient components. So obviously when we eat or drink something, we start in the mouth. In the mouth, we have a couple different organs or structures that play a role in our digestive. We have the salivary glands, we have the teeth, and then we have the tongue. The salivary glands are going to produce saliva, and saliva has a chemical in it called amylase, which helps start the breakdown of carbohydrates, sugars, and starches. Your tongue is going to move food around and help break down, mix it with the saliva. Your teeth are going to gnash and tear apart the different food particles. When you swallow, that food is going to go down your pharynx, and it's going to come across the epiglottis, which is going to push the food down into this long tube called the esophagus. The esophagus sits just behind the trachea. So remember, we talked about respiratory structures. We talked about how that epiglottis is going to shut the trachea off so that food does not go down your windpipe, but instead goes down into this esophagus. Your esophagus is this long tube that's going to carry the food into your stomach. Oftentimes people think that the stomach is where most of our digestion takes place, which is actually not true. Most of our digestion or chemical digestion is going to take place in the small intestines. The stomach is going to empty into the small intestines, which is this big structure right here. The small intestines is divided into three regions: the duodenum, which is the part that's attached to the stomach, the jejunum, which is in the middle, and then the ileum, which will eventually attach to the large intestines. In this area of the duodenum, we have a couple of accessory organs. Food doesn't actually pass through these accessory organs, but these organs will actually squirt chemicals or substances into this duodenum area that will help with digestion. So the liver and gallbladder and bile duct are all involved in making bile, storing it, and then pushing it into that duodenum through the bile duct, and bile helps break down fats. And then your pancreas is going to be responsible for producing insulin. One of the things it produces is insulin, which will also be considered an accessory organ. It'll dump that insulin in, and that insulin helps our cells take up sugars that it can use to make ATP. So as the food makes its way through the small intestines, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, this is going to be where almost all of our chemical digestion takes place. And then finally, we get to the large intestines. Your large intestines is divided into the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and then the rectum, where food will any undigested material will end up being removed or eliminated out of the body. So those are the different structures, the overall structures involved in your digestive system. So if we look here at what these functions are going to be. So again, starting with the salivary glands, the function of your salivary glands is to produce saliva. Your saliva contains an enzyme that's called amylase, and this amylase helps begin the breakdown of carbohydrates, which is considered chemical digestion. It's the very beginning of it. There's not a lot of carbohydrate breakdown that occurs, but there is some chemical digestion that occurs. Your teeth and tongue are involved in mechanical digestion. They're going to break and tear the food into smaller pieces so that we can, again, try and get all of the smallest nutrients available out of them. Your tongue is going to move the food around, and that's being broken up by your teeth, and it's going to assist in swallowing. the big wad of food that you have in your mouth that's made up of food, broken up food and saliva is called a bolus. So if you really want to appreciate a bolus, go grab some crackers, chew them, keep chewing, don't swallow them, and you'll get that big wad of crackers and spit. That's actually a bolus. When you swallow that bolus, so the tongue will help push the food to the back of the oral cavity, where it will then go down the pharynx or the throat and hit the epiglottis. And the epiglottis, like we talked about with respiration, it's going to cover the trachea when you swallow so that food does not go down your windpipe. It instead goes behind to the long tube, which is called the esophagus. The esophagus is this long tube that travels from your pharynx down to your stomach. It has these alternating contractions, waves of contractions, which we call peristalsis, and this is going to push the food into the stomach. This is why if you stand on your head and eat something, the food will still make its way down because of these strong muscular contractions. So your esophagus is going to be mechanical digestion because as it's squeezing, breaking down that food a little bit more in terms of size. The esophagus is going to open up and empty into the stomach, which is a large J-shaped pouch where food is going to be further broken down mechanically because your stomach's going to churn. And then also we're going to start some chemical digestion. Not a ton. Most of the chemical digestion will be in the small intestines, but some carbohydrate digestion will continue, and we'll just start the beginnings of breaking down proteins and fat that's in our food. Most of that digestion or that breakdown of proteins and fat will again occur in the small intestines, but we'll at least get it started in the stomach. The food that's now mixed with gastric juices and stomach acid and enzymes, that wad of food is called chyme, and it's like a pasty kind of material. That chyme will then enter into the small intestines through a valve called the pyloric sphincter. And the small intestines is divided into three areas: the duodenum, which is the first part attached to the stomach, the jejunum, which is the middle section, and the ileum, which will be attached to the large intestines. This is going to be where almost all of your chemical digestion takes place. So we're going to take the pizza that you ate, and we're going to pull out the proteins, and we're going to pull out the fats, and we're going to pull out the rest of the carbohydrates in order to use those substances for energy. Once the food, any undigested material in the small intestines will then get delivered to the large intestines. Now, there are a couple of accessory organs, like I mentioned, the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, and the bile duct. These are accessory organs because food will never actually pass through these organs, like the food never goes to the liver or it never goes into the pancreas, but instead, these structures are going to deliver enzymes and chemicals into the small intestines that will help break down food chemically. So like I mentioned, the pancreas is going to secrete insulin. This is going to help our cells take in the sugar that we need to make ATP. And the liver, the gallbladder, and the bile duct are all going to produce a substance called bile, which helps break down fats. The gallbladder stores that bile, and then when needed, when you eat something really fatty, the bile duct will then deliver that bile to the small intestines to mix in with the food and help with fat breakdown. Once you get to the large intestines, there are 4 sections of the large intestines: the ascending colon, which goes up, the transverse, which goes across, the descending, which goes down, and then there's a little curve at the very bottom called the sigmoid colon. And the function of your large intestines is to absorb water out of any undigested material. So this is going to make what we call feces. We're sucking the water out of anything that wasn't undigested. So if your large intestines are not working properly and they don't absorb water, that's when you end up with diarrhea, because you get all this watery feces because your large intestines is not absorbing the water out of that undigested material like it should. Vice versa, if it's absorbing too much, that can be constipation, making your stools or your feces really hard. There are 2 parts, like subparts of the large intestines: the cecum, which is a pouch at the very beginning of the ascending colon, and it's going to absorb fluids and salts and then help produce mucus. So again, that mucus helps make sure that things can slide through that digestive tract a little easier. And then also the appendix. For humans, there's no life necessary function of the appendix. We do think that maybe it's a place where good bacteria is stored to help break down food products. And then maybe play a role in immune response a little bit. The rectum then, the large intestines will then empty into the rectum, which will take food out the anus, and this is just the passageway for feces to actually exit the body. So those are the parts of the digestive tract and then what those parts actually do. So looking specifically at the individual parts of particular structures in the digestive tract, so looking at the oral cavity, we've talked about some of these structures before when we talked about respiration. So the very hard part of the back of your mouth is called the hard palate. Behind that is the soft palate, that's the fleshy part, and then the uvula, which hangs down below. And again, that's going to help prevent food and liquids from going back up into your nasal cavity. We also have your teeth. You have 4 incisors, which are in the front, 2, 1 on each side, cuspids, 4, so 2 on each side, premolars, and then 6 molars, 3 on each side. So those are the structures that make up your oral cavity. Again, almost all, there's going to be a lot of mechanical digestion that's taking place as we break up that food, and then just a small amount of chemical digestion. Here is looking at the anatomy of a tooth. So if you look at the tooth, the outermost layer here is the enamel. And then this inner layer is called the dentin. So the dentin will actually come right through here and then curve up into this area. In between, or in the center of that dentin, is the pulp cavity or the pulp. And then within that pulp cavity is going to be where your nerves and your blood vessels will kind of sit in here. Your tooth is divided into this top part, which is called the crown, and then the bottom part, which is the root. And the dividing factor that between the two will be your gingiva or your gum. So where that gum line would be. Moving on to the stomach. Your stomach is also divided into sections. We have the cardiac region, which is this region right where the esophagus kind of dumps into. We have the fundus region, which is in this top curvature area right here. The body, which is in the middle of the stomach. And then the pylorus, which is going to be down at the bottom. The pyloric sphincter, this is going to be sort of like a valve that's going to open, that's going to let the food pass through the large intestines. We don't just dump it all in at once. We slowly let the food into that small intestines, that duodenum, in order to make sure that it's got the proper amount of time to chemically digest the food. There are 2 big curves on the stomach. This outer curve is called the greater curvature, and the inner curve is called the lesser curvature. I don't know why this is in here, so we'll take that out. The rugae are going to be folds or wrinkles that are inside of the stomach. That rugae is going to allow the stomach to expand then when you're holding food, and then kind of shrink back up when you need to. It increases the surface area so that we can, it allows it to stretch, that stomach to kind of stretch. So they're really the rugaes are folds. I said wrinkles, but folds would be a better analogy. So again, in the stomach, you have a small amount of carbohydrate digestion takes place, and just the beginning of protein and fat digestion that takes place. Lots of stomach acid and enzymes are produced in the stomach to help break down food. All right, your large intestines then. Your large intestines, we talked about the small intestines and its divisions. So your large intestines is going to be divided into the ascending colon, which is this section right here, the transverse colon, which goes across, the descending colon, which comes down, and this little curve right here, which is the sigmoid colon. And then down here is going to be your rectum. Here's your cecum. So again, this is going to be where some water and salts are absorbed, and then the mucus is kind of produced. And then down here will be your appendix. So if you get your appendix removed, they would go in and they would take this particular section out. Function of the large intestines is to absorb water out of that undigested material, pass it through each of those different colons in order to remove it from the body via or as feces. So those are the structures that are involved in your digestive system.